Now, a new study has revealed that trying to protect children from risks they face online may actually be futile. Instead, the Education Policy Institute has called on officials to focus on teaching teenagers methods to maintain their emotional and mental well-being.
What we found, interestingly, if you try and restrict young people's use of social media, that can have damaging impacts because they can't develop the skills they need to protect themselves from harm. So what we're saying is that we need to help young people build resilience. That means increasing their digital skills, so being able to block somebody who's upsetting them or changing their privacy settings, but also their emotional skills, so how they can cope with someone being mean to them online or regulating their own emotions. Well, let's discuss all of this with Ella Whelan, the assistant editor at Spiked Online magazine, and also joining us from Central London is Nick Harrop, campaigns manager of Young Minds, which is a charity committed to improving the emotional well-being and mental health of children and young people. A very good afternoon to you both. Ella, if I may begin with you then, do we think that this is wise advice to parents, that any efforts to protect their children online may indeed be futile?
At first, I thought that the report was a kind of breath of fresh air, because I think the prevailing wisdom is that, social media and the internet is a great harm to children, that they're hugely at risk. And I think initially the EPAR report was saying, well, actually, hang on, kids, the internet might not be all that bad, and kids do get some good skills from it. It helps them socialise, and that's obviously true, because when kids are on the internet, most likely they're talking to their peers, as we did, talking to our friends on the phone when we were young. The problem, I think, is in that it's calling for more intervention into kids' lives, and the focus on the almost obsession with emotional well-being, I think, is sort of really overblowing the risks that children face. I think telling parents that their children are going to face huge risks and damaging consequences for having time on the internet, time on social media, is really a sort of fear-mongering, actually.
OK, well, it's fear-mongering. Nick Harrop, what do you make of that?
Well, we know that social media can have positive and negative effects on children and young people's mental health. It can be a great way of expressing yourself, expressing your identity, and if you are struggling, it can be a great way of reaching out for help. But it is true that cyberbullying is incredibly common, and that for a lot of young people, it's all too easy to compare your life to other people's lives on Instagram or other social media platforms, and to feel like your life isn't good enough. So it does have an effect on your mental health as well. And we agree with this report that the key is education, in making sure that every child gets lessons where they get to discuss the positives and negatives of social media and how to react if things go wrong.
OK, Ella, that seems very reasonable, doesn't it? I mean, we know there is evidence that not all young people, as you say, but many young people find that it's very easy to get advice on how to, say, self-harm or become anorexic or indeed become radicalised through social media. And for those young people, there should be education on how to have emotional resilience.
I think that what needs to happen is that we need to get a little bit more trust in parents, because obviously if children are accessing, the report was talking about children accessing the internet at home, and obviously the people who are in control of what children do at home is rightly their parents, and I think most parents will monitor what their children, especially if they're sort of not late teens, if they're children, are doing on the internet, and that's where the responsibility lies, with the parents to take care of that. I think if we kind of overemphasize the need for focusing on emotional resilience or emotional well-being, we're saying that to children, this tool, the internet, this great, wonderful, modern, piece of technology, is going to put you in danger. And I think that is unnecessary fear-mongering. But really, the key thing is that it's not that kids have changed. So from previous generations, kids have always been cruel to one another, said nasty things to one another. These things have always happened. They're now happening online, but the scale or the content of it hasn't actually changed. What has changed is adults' response to it. And I think it's adults that are putting fears onto children unnecessarily in this case.
That's interesting. I mean, the question I wanted to ask you, Nick, is whether or not you think that young people are equipped and have the emotional resilience to deal with the kinds of pressures and bullying or whatever it might be that they suffer online. But it appears from what Ella was saying just there that actually she thinks that much of this is the responsibility, if not the fault, of the parents.
Well, I think for parents, it's often not that easy to understand everything your kids are doing online. And there are lots of positives of using social media, but it's just important that kids learn about it from a young age. I mean, I do think that bullying is worse than it used to be and that it can follow you home now. So maybe children have always been mean to each other, but now you can have cyberbullying around the clock, so that can make things worse. And really, education isn't about fear-mongering, it's about having open discussions about the positives and negatives of living your life online and how to respond. You know, if you do come across content that you find disturbing, or if you do feel hurt by the way that someone's treating you, it's really not supposed to be about fear-mongering, but just about helping kids develop resilience if there are problems.
And whilst resilience, as you describe it there, sounds so very sensible, are you actually surprised that this report is actually saying it's useless, it's futile for parents to try and intervene? A lot of parents would be very alarmed at hearing that and want to have parental controls and know what their children are up to, but they were saying if you take their phones away or their social media away, you could be causing them more harm because they could be socially inadequate when they are in the school forum, wherever it may be.
Well, at Young Minds, we run a parents' helpline, so we get calls from parents who are worried about what they should be doing. And we don't think it's useless for parents to talk to their children about how they're using the internet at all. But there are limits to how much you can protect children from all risks online. And that's why it's so important that children learn about the internet and the kind of risks they might experience, so they do know a bit about how to handle them for themselves.
And Ella, I detect just from talking to you this afternoon that I don't know if I'm right, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's almost a sense that you think young people are mollycoddled a little bit, that perhaps, you know, this emphasis on their mental health may be overblown and that you don't really think it's as big a problem as we may be making it.
Yeah, that's a nice way of summing it up. I do think we have a very strange and I think potentially damaging obsession with young people's emotional well-being, in that we're cultivating the idea that this generation, who is really no different to previous generations other than they have this tool, the internet and social media, is somehow more vulnerable, more susceptible to having emotional problems, mental health problems. And really there is no evidence for it. The EPI report itself said there is no direct evidence that links social media use to mental health problems. So what we're really saying is we're speculating that when kids go online, they see damaging things and then become damaged people. Now that to me is really kind of suggests that we have to kind of step back, say what's really going on here. And I think what's going on is an adult panic about what's going on with kids, and I really think the message is that the kids are all right. And
I think we might have expected you to say that as a big tech advocate, Ella, but I want to ask you, Nick, I mean, she's questioning the evidence in all of this, but from your experience, albeit anecdotal, of dealing with young people, is there a link, do you believe, between social media and young people's mental health and problems associated with it?
Well, the evidence isn't entirely clear, and like I say, there are lots of positives about social media as well as maybe some negatives. On the wider point about children and young people's mental health, I mean, the number of children and young people arriving in A&E with a mental health problem has more than doubled in the last few years, and 90% of senior school teachers say that problems have got worse in the last few years. So there is some evidence that this isn't just an invention of adults, but things are actually getting harder for children. Now, social media may have a role to play in that, but we're not saying social media is bad, we're not saying turn back the clock, we're just saying let's look at the positives and negatives and let's make that part of education from a young age.
OK, so what do we do as part of this education then? Assuming that there are these negatives online, how do young people develop resilience? And also, you know, I wonder if there is an implication that those who then do succumb to self-harming or whatever it may be through social media are uneducated and haven't been, you know, informed on how to deal with their emotions, which isn't really fair, is it?
Well, the kind of education we're talking about is partly understanding the tools of social media, so how to block or report content that you find difficult to deal with, but also how to deal with it emotionally, and the fact that, you know, you can reach out for help to adults or to peers, you can talk about what you're going through, and finally to take responsibility for what you put online. Just remember that what you say online is just as real as what you say offline, and to think about the implications that can have.
OK, Nick Harrop, Ella Whelan, really good to get your views this afternoon. Thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you.
Northern